Good evening, listeners. I'm Thea Haver with Modern Albuquerque, and tonight we're going to be talking about the Albuquerque Museum's Walter McDonald slide collection and revisiting the 1970s thanks to the memories of Albuquerque residents Mo Palmer and Roxanna Caird. Joining us first is Mo. Mo, a lot of people know you as a historian, author, and as the former photo archivist of the Albuquerque Museum. Let's talk about your role in preserving the Walter McDonald photos that are now on display in the Let the Sunshine In exhibit. When and how did you find the slides that McDonald had taken?
I had been a volunteer there for 5 years, and in 1992 I got the position of archivist. And whenever I had an opportunity, I would just rat through everything there because what was on our state-of-the-art at the time, but minimal computer system, was just the primary collections that the curator selected as the ones that needed to be put online. So we spent a lot of time doing that, but in my spare time, I would just go through all the drawers because we had, I believe, when that initial system crashed, I think we had 18,000 photos scanned, and I estimate that the collection was holding close to 100,000. So that's quite a discrepancy in what was available to the public and what was stored in the drawers. So there was this little metal cabinet full of these slides, and I had no idea what they were. By then, our experienced curator, Byron Johnson, had moved on to be the director of a museum. And so there was really no one to ask, and I just started looking at them, and I thought, this is a bonanza of documenting our town before urban renewal and before everything changed forever. So there are a lot of older images in there of things that aren't there anymore. And so when I had a minute, I would just go through them, and they were just lined up in a drawer. I had no idea who McDonald was. I had no idea what these were. I did know what the content of the pictures was because I remembered for the most part, having grown up here. So I am from Artesia, which is why I'm so sophisticated. But we moved up here for good in 1955. And so I would just go through them, and then I thought, these need to be copied and saved. And I had a volunteer named Dick Berg, who's still with me now as a volunteer with Historic Albuquerque Incorporated. And I said, Dick, what can you do? We need a copy of these in case something happens. And he invented a way to photograph them slide by slide. And he also, based on his good memory, because he had moved here in, I think, 1952, he was able to identify a lot of those things by sight. And so he photographed every single slide, and I believe we determined for you that there were between 4,000 and 8,000, if I remember correctly, slides. So the reason they are labeled 1996, the way that a museum accession record works is it begins with the year that you took it in. Now, we didn't know the year of those. And so I simply started assigning him 1996 when he started copying the collection. So that's the actual date when he began to save it for us. I did not know who McDonald was. I didn't have a clue. In fact, I'm not real sure at this point who that is. But I do remember a horrible story. And I believe he came in one day to the museum, and he said, I took all these pictures of Albuquerque, and I'd like to see them. Well, of course, I wanted to accommodate him, but they were not recorded anywhere. And so I finally had to say, I'm sorry, but we don't appear to have those, not knowing that all those slides were in that cabinet. And I have felt badly about that ever since.
Well, I just saw him on an episode of Colores talking about the collection, so I think he knows you found them. We've talked a bit about your career at the Albuquerque Museum in the 90s, but let's go back to the 1970s. What were you doing then?
I was very active in establishing search and rescue operations in Albuquerque, which had nothing to do with history. And my husband and I were quite involved. Search and rescue was a new a volunteer effort that was getting off the ground. And there were several organizations and several people involved in it. and ours was Albuquerque Search and Rescue, I think was the name of it. And I also worked closely with Joe McKinney, and so we were involved in establishing search and rescue field operations. And my friend and I started the first search and rescue field food team in the United States. So we were able to go into the field on every search and provide coffee and sandwiches and food for these hardworking people who were out there doing the rescues.
Are there any stories that stand out in your memory from the time that you were establishing that?
Yes, someone had started down the La Luz Trail from the top of the mountain with their dog, which was quite large and, as I recall, was a St. Bernard. And the dog's pads got so cut up and scratched from walking the La Luz that they had to stop. And the teams were called out, and we met at the base of the tram, and Mountain Rescue walked up with a litter and got the dog and carried him back down. And I'll never forget seeing the lights on their headlamps coming down the trail with this dog on a stretcher, and it was just so incredible and touching. Now, that is not to say that we didn't go out and search for people. We did that as well. That one just stands out in my mind, and it was an all-volunteer effort. We were not reimbursed for anything, not for gasoline or food. We had to get donations. And I believe we were donated a trailer, and I would pull that trailer behind my 69 Rebel, and I had 2 flat tires coming down from the crest one night, and it took us forever to raise anyone on the radio because it was about 4 in the morning to come out and rescue that car and that trailer. So I remember that as a silly story. I was one of only 2 women in the United States who was accepted into the Coast Guard School of Search and Rescue. So having established that field food team was very important. It's come a long way, and it was very important to be a pioneer.
Mo, you are very much a cultural historian. You're better than anyone I know at identifying buildings and people in photographs. Tell me a little bit about what you remember Albuquerque being like during the period that McDonald was documenting.
Most of our older buildings were still standing then. So we took them for granted. We had the Alvarado. No, we didn't. It was torn down in 70. But we still had the NTR Mijo building, and most of the older buildings that we now lament and mourn were still there. The Corber building. I remember all that. Because when I was growing up, you would get on the bus and go downtown and go shopping. There were a lot of stores that were still downtown, so you still did go down there to shop, even though the malls had opened in 61 and 64. So what you're seeing in those McDonald slides is a huge reflection of what this place looked like before urban renewal took it out. You could get a parking ticket looking for a parking space because you had to drive around and around and around. Downtown was hugely vibrant and very important, and we went downtown for everything. We went there to go to the movie. There were dentist's offices on the second floors of some of those old buildings. So you went to the dentist. I had a doctor that was in one, and we were always going downtown. Fedway was down there, and that's now Dillard's. But it's not there anymore, and Kistler Collister was down there, and Paris Shoes, and just the retailers. There was a McClellan's, there was a Woolworths, there was a Crest, and so you were always downtown buying things. And there was a Simon's Western Wear, and I stole my parents' car. My parents went out of town, and I was determined to have a cowboy hat for the fair. So I took the car and drove down to Simon's and bought a cowboy hat. But because it was a clutch car, it was a standard transmission, and I didn't know how to drive. And I got myself caught in a storm drain, and I was sitting there trying to look all nonchalant when my parents' best friend drove by, and he was the Chief Justice of the New Mexico Supreme Court. But he didn't punish me. I had to go to his house and confess. I drove the car illegally, but he said, okay, thank you for telling me. So you have to comprehend the smallness of the community. You know, it's huge now.
Mo, you're absolutely right. The Albuquerque of the late 60s and 70s, when McDonald was out there documenting, has changed immensely. And his slides, as well as other film and documents recorded at the time, are really key in our understanding of how the built environment and the landscape of Albuquerque has been altered since the late 60s and into the 1970s.
The Albuquerque Transportation Depot, which they built in an imitation of the Alvarado, it's not the real thing, but it's better to have something on that lot than nothing. Okay? And when I walked up Gold, when they first built that, and I saw those four towers that they imitated the Alvarado, I wept, because at least there was something there instead of this parking lot where I had parked when I worked downtown in the early 70s. I can't tell you how full downtown was of buildings. And there was something unique and special in each one to go to. And now they're gone. So what do you think a building like that would be worth in terms of tourism? People would go to look at that. So this has been a major change.
What are your final thoughts on the McDonald photo series?
McDonald, whoever he may have been, did a wonderful thing by documenting all that. At the time, they probably did not realize they were documenting the future past. They didn't understand that it would all be gone.
Well, thanks to your work and the continuing work of the Albuquerque Museum's photo archivists, now some of these photos can be viewed online as well as seen in the Let the Sunshine In exhibit. Mo, thank you for highlighting your role as a photo archivist here for us tonight.
As a historian, I hate progress. You know, we're preserving the past for the future in photo history. Terribly important.
One of the ways that photo archivists like Mo date images is by looking at the clothes that people in a photograph are wearing. And here to reminisce about early 70s fashion is Roxanna Caird. Roxanna Caird is a first-generation native of Albuquerque with a closet overflowing in Albuquerque fashion and history. Roxanna, how would you describe your relationship to fashion?
Actually, I probably need to start with the fact that I have two closets overflowing with fashion, but that's just me. So, and I guess, you know, my relation with fashion started back when I was, probably about 8 or 9 years old, and I would design and make clothes for my Barbie doll, which was not easy because, you know, Barbie had the most bizarre figure ever, and so to sew small clothes for a Barbie doll was something that was kind of unique. And then as I grew older, my mother hired someone to kind of teach me more about sewing, and so I became even more interested in fashion once I started designing and making clothes for myself. That kind of was where my relationship with fashion started. It continued on then after I graduated from high school. I actually attended community college or a junior college in Dallas, and I studied fashion and design there. In past years, I designed and made a lot of my own clothes and clothes for my mother. I've always had a strong interest in fashion, as I say, from the time I was 8 or 9 years old.
So, what do you remember about what Albuquerque was wearing in the early 70s? What colors or fabrics or silhouettes were popular?
As I remember it, the rise in the women's movement was an impetus for a lot of the fashion in the early 70s. I think one of the things that I remember is when I was attending Highland High School, starting as a sophomore in 1970, girls could not wear pants. The only day that we could wear pants was on what was called Fair Day, and that was the day that we were let out for a half day to go to the state fair. And if you contrast that with my senior year in high school, which was 1972, it was kind of an anything goes type of fashion world. One of the things that I remember were hot pants, which were very short pants, and the fabrics on them, they would be, say, like leather shorts or something like that. It would be what hot pants would be equivalent to. Tube tops were really popular. Bandana tops, which were made from like a large bandana that you had the string around your neck and then tied the rest of it in the back. So those were very popular. I think the thing that was really something that changed in the early 70s was the advent of jeans as a form of dress, both for men and for women. And they became just incredibly popular during the early 70s. I remember buying my first pair of jeans probably when I was sophomore or junior in high school, and my first pair of Levi's for $8. Jeans that were frayed or worn looking, kind of a bleached look or something like that, were extremely popular. Bell-bottom jeans were really popular. I remember that with jeans, one of the things you wanted them to be really tight. And so one of the ways to make sure that they were really tight is you would wash them, and then when they were wet, you'd put them on and wear them so that they kind of shrunk and conformed to your body. So that was one of those fad type things that happened with jeans. Peasant blouses were really popular. Anything that was kind of ethnic, too, was really popular. Embroidered blouses. As far as shoes go, boots became really popular, especially lace-up boots. Platform shoes. I remember seeing signs both here and when I was living in Dallas by the escalators that, cautioned women getting on and off of the escalators with platform shoes because they were kind of a tripping hazard just walking on them, let alone trying to get on and off of an escalator with them. I remember and this would have been probably more in the 1973 to 75 period. One of the things that became popular were women's suits. Women started wearing pantsuits much more often, and where the pantsuits themselves were tailored, the blouses were more that you wore with them were more feminine. And then there was, of course, with the advent of different types of fabrics, stretchy fabrics and knits and things like that, there were blouses that had, for lack of a better word, kind of artwork on them. Things like Art Nouveau prints or graphic designs of sunsets or flowers. Another thing that I remember is that women wore scarves more often then, and not big wrapping scarves as much as little kind of like necktie type scarves. Those were just kind of some of the highlights. As far as colors, I think that, the colors were whereas the late 60s had gone to these really vibrant, bright, fluorescent colors, I think the 70s started to become more muted, and especially with the emphasis on the more natural look, the ethnic look. So colors probably became more muted, and more of colors you would see in nature rather than these really brilliant, if you will, man-made colors.
So of course these clothes were coming from somewhere. So let's talk about shopping. Mo had mentioned some of the downtown shopping destinations, but both Windrock and Coronado malls were operating, and there were stores in between uptown and downtown, like the Gisler College store on the corner of San Mateo and Lomas. Where were you buying most of your clothes from in the 1970s, and what do you remember about it?
It was a fun time to shop here in Albuquerque. You asked about places in between downtown and uptown, and one of the stores that I liked shopping at was called Margot's La Mode, which was next door to the Highland Theater. It occupied the space where MDI is now. The one thing I remember about Margot's is their shoe department. They had a fabulous shoe department. There was another store in Windrock that I remember, and maybe I remember it more just for the store design than the actual clothing, because I was definitely not one of their target customers. The store's name was Jordan's, and it carried very upscale, almost cutting-edge clothing, high-fashion clothing for Albuquerque. And it was just a beautiful store. The other places that I shopped for clothing, there was a store in Coronado Center called Rhodes, and it occupied the space where Kohl's is now on the south end of the mall. They had really an all-around great selection of clothing, and probably catered a little bit more toward someone my age, or had, what we called then the junior department. There was another store in Coronado, which I remember. Again, I kind of focused more on the style of the store rather than the clothing, because it's probably catered more to women my mother's age. But the name of the store was Carlin's. And when you entered the store, it had these beautiful pane glass doors that were barn doors, and so they were shut at the bottom and open at the top. And so you opened the bottom door to go into Carlin's. Once you got inside Carlin's, in the middle of the store, it had this circular sofa that was, I'm remembering that it was covered in like a hot pink or magenta velvet. And so it's very much a very feminine store. As I say, I remember the store more than I remember the clothing there. The other store that you mentioned, Thea, is Gisler Hollister. And that was just very upscale store all the way around. There again, I think it catered more to tailored, people who were buying tailored business-like clothing rather than teenagers like me who were in jeans and peasant tops. But there again, it was a beautifully appointed store, and I had wonderful displays in that store. The store itself was, kind of a statement of the times as far as the architecture of that period. Those are probably the places that I shopped the most.
So you were, of course, making some of your own clothes. Where were you getting your fabric and materials from?
Well, at that time, it was, and I think it's kind of making a resurgence now, but there were more fabric stores around. There was a great one that was in Coronado called Mr. G's Fabrics, which had great specialty type of fabrics. More of the actual department stores still had fabric sections in them and sewing sections in them. There were more places to choose from as far as buying fabrics.
Was there a single item that you remember wearing in the 70s that you've never forgotten?
In 1971, I traveled to Europe. I bought a pair of kind of like gladiator lace-up sandals in Florence. I remember bringing, those back with me and wearing those in Albuquerque, and they were just like, for Albuquerque at that time, that was a real statement, and I was so proud of those sandals, and I think I wore them until they were just in shreds, because it was something I bought on my own and was just very different for Albuquerque.
And possibly one of the few items that's not saved in your closet.
Unfortunately not.
Thanks to Mo Palmer and Roxanna Caird for joining us this evening. This is Thea Haver with Modern Albuquerque, signing off.